So John 18, okay, so we've been through all these personal interactions from the upper room, going down into the Kidron Valley, into the Mount of Olives, into Gethsemane, which is where we're at now. We just went through John 17, where Jesus is praying to the Father, and just the profound revelations of oneness that came through that chapter. Now we're starting the passion, or the betrayal. And I just want you to keep in mind that he predicted all this. He already said all of this to the disciples to prepare him for what he's about to go through. So God is in control. So even as you see all the betrayal and all the disgusting things that are happening to him, he's in control. He's volunteered for this. Okay, this is not him being a victim. He's voluntarily going through all of this for you, right? Something I thought was fascinating when I did study on this a while ago was not at this time, but about 30 years after this, just to show you the depth of how big the feast was of Passover. There was a time, and Josephus recorded this about 30 years later, 256,000 lambs were slain during the Passover at one point in 1 week. The blood of the lambs that could not take away sin, all that blood, 256,000 lambs perished. They could not take away sin. But we are about to see one lamb doing just that. But just a 250,000 lambs in 1 week. That's just crazy to think about. All right, so John 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, the words of John 17 prayer of oneness, I and you and me, I pray for them. All that we just covered last week is what that is referring to, which is a perfect example of how the chapter breakdowns are not accurate as far as really in the right places. It's a continual thought. He just completed praying to the Father, and now he is moving on, and he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Brook in the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden. And so just think about this. This is the Gethsemane garden. Gethsemane means the oil press. That's what Gethsemane means. It's the place of crushing, which is exactly what's about to happen to Jesus. And so he and his disciples entered the garden of crushing at this point. Now, as we go through here, there's two gardens now that we can reflect on, right? In the beginning was the Garden of Eden with the first Adam. Intimacy with God was lost in the Garden of Eden. But now it is being paid for to be restored in another garden, Gethsemane, with the second Adam, or the last Adam, as Paul refers to him, and that is Jesus. So now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because this was Jesus' favorite place to go. And he took his disciples here all the time, whenever they're in Jerusalem area. And so he knew the place where Jesus often met with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and many officers, or some officers, from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons for one guy. Why would they bring this many soldiers to arrest Jesus, just one man who's never been violent? Well, take that back. He overturned the money changers' tables. So that was angry. So remember that. Remember the money changers' tables. There were an estimated several hundred soldiers at the temple the day that he overturned the money changers' tables. And they were there for security because there's over 250,000 people, just like I talked about 256,000 lambs, which is one lamb for a household. So that's 256,000 households. It's a lot of people. There's several hundred people that were there for security to control the temple. And the Praetorian, where the Roman, Pontius Pilate, which we're going to hear about him in this chapter, actually, that building was right next to the Temple Mount, so they could oversee all the activity for the feast because they were afraid of riots. And so that's why they put the Praetorium right there, the governor's palace, basically. So they could look over all the activities going on to make sure riots wouldn't take place. And so there's several hundred security guards there when Jesus is overturning the money changers' tables, and they couldn't stop him. They could not stop one guy from doing that and creating that scene. And I said this earlier in John, that in and of itself was a miracle. So them now being in Passover, and they couldn't stop them before when he did these things. And they also tried to arrest him earlier and never were able to complete the task. So that kind of can give you some insight on why there were so many people that came to arrest him, because they couldn't do it before. He had that kind of power. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, okay, as they came through here, knowing what's about to happen, he came forward. It reminds me of when David confronted Goliath. He ran after Goliath and then threw the stone. He didn't, hold back. He went after the thing that he was confronting. So Jesus, knowing that they were going to, crush him, the oil press, they were going to crush him and destroy him and crucify him. He knew all this. He told all the disciples that, knowing that, he came forward. He didn't hide, but he went forward and faced the crowd and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And I'm going to really focus on this next text, because Jesus said to them, "I am he." But I'm actually going to correct that, because that is not accurate. If your Bible says he said to them, "I am he," that is not correct. The original text said this, and I'll explain this. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am." Period. No he. I am. That just goes back to our lack of understanding of some of these terms back in the day. But when we go to study the original text and understanding that historical context as well, that's a bigger statement with him saying, "I am." He didn't say, "I'm here." He didn't say this, "I am he." The original text is "I am." In the Greek Septuagint, the Greek word would be ego eimi, which is the same term when Moses encountered the burning bush. It states the exact same term, ego eimi, which is "I am," or "I am who I am." That's where they get the whole version of Yahweh. The Jews called it the Tetragrammaton, YHVH or YHWH, Yahweh. A lot of people, they would not mention it. They just say, "Blessed be his name." They would not say that term. "I am" is what he said, which is the original name of God. So, hello, that's a big statement there. We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, and he said, "I am." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. In verse 6, when Jesus said to them, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. That just gives me chills. Now, when Jesus stated this, it was just like what Moses said at the burning bush. The power of God showed up at that point. Just like when Moses at the burning bush said, "Take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground." This was a holy moment. And then verse 7, so he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am. Get rid of the he that's in that text. It's not in the original text. So if you seek me, let these men go, which he's talking about his disciples. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken in just the last chapter. Of those whom he gave me, I have lost not one, except for Judas Iscariot, the son of perdition, and who was with the army at this point, come in to encounter Christ. So we just read this fulfillment when we just read this in John 17. It's now this quickly being fulfilled. Now, verse 10, when Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? There's twofold aspect to this passage I want to cover. Note, I don't think Jesus was trying to cut off the guy's ear. I think he was trying to kill him. He was trying to fight him off. He had no fear. He was protecting his Lord, which was actually the exact opposite of what Jesus wanted him to do. Jesus was telling him, this is what's going to happen to me. And so Jesus, so that Peter, takes the knife or the sword and cuts off this guy's ear. Jesus had to actually do a miracle here, not just out of the need for compassion on Malchus, but so that Peter can do what was planned for him to feed my sheep. Later on, after he recovered from the betrayal and all that stuff, he goes to Peter and says, Peter, do you love me? And he goes, well, of course I do. And he asks him that, Peter, do you love me? He says, oh, Lord, you know. I think it's 3 times. And then the third time he said, Lord, you know. Like, you know better than I do if I love you or not. He goes, when you recover, feed my sheep. Well, killing somebody or even cutting their ear off, especially somebody that was in authority, even though it was the temple guard, that was a capital offense. So we just about saw 3 crosses on Calvary, one for Peter as well, except for Jesus healed Malchus, and thus the evidence of that crime was no longer there. So Peter actually, out of his zeal, was flying in the face of what God wanted to see happen. So it's a fascinating thought. He did a miracle, not just out of compassion, but so that God's will could be done in starting the church with Peter. So interesting thought. Anyway, verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And I'm gonna go off on that here in a little bit because there's a little bit more there on Annas and Caiaphas that I'll talk about here in a minute. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And we're thinking that was John because he's not mentioning himself, more than likely. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. In verse 16, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the servant girl who had kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, before I go further on this whole thing with Peter, let's touch on Annas. We see 6 trials that Jesus is going to go through. First of all, with Annas, then with Caiaphas, then with the entire Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish leaders of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, then Pilate, and then Pilate would send him to King Herod, and then Herod would send him back to Pilate. Those are six trials. But the first question I had, I said when I don't understand something doesn't make sense, we want to ask those questions. Well, my question was this: why did they go with Annas? It says he was the father-in-law. of Caiaphas, who was the high priest. Why didn't they just go right to the high priest? So I dug into that. Here's what's interesting. I think this was because of an issue of positional authority. Positional authority and spiritual authority. Positional authority is authority that is given to somebody by men that not everybody's necessarily going to respect. Spiritual authority or natural authority, in this case, is who actually the guards respected. And this will be mirrored a little bit later too. But since Rome was ruling, normally the high priest was a role that you had for life. It wasn't something you got voted in every 4 years like we have here in the United States. It was, I'm the high priest, I'm in, except for the Rome would then choose a high priest that would meet their expectations of who could be my puppet. So when Pilate took over as governor of the province, Annas was removed and Caiaphas was put into place because apparently he could probably control him more easily. So that's my thought from looking at the study of that. So Annas used to be the high priest, and now he's no longer, but he's the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Now, he chose to remove Annas because of wanting somebody they can control. So even though Caiaphas was the high priest, clearly the guards had more respect for Annas because he was the original high priest. And so they saw him as the high priest, even though, Rome says somebody else is. All right. So this is a perfect example, I think, of positional authority. But there's another aspect to this, I think, of why Annas was the first one they went to, because he ran the business of the temple. He ran the money changers' tables. So if you forgot the context of that, all these people were coming into Jerusalem and they're going to sacrifice their lamb as part of Passover, right? Just what we see in Exodus. And the requirements for the lamb is it had to be without spot or blemish. So here's how crooked these people were at the Temple Mount. They brought their lamb to sacrifice, and then the guards or the people overseeing the worship at the temple would say, your lamb is not without spot or blemish. So you're going to have to buy one of our lambs. And it's going to be a pretty penny. And so it was a money-making scheme for the leadership there. And so you bring your own lamb. They say, it's spotted. It's not clean. It's not perfect enough. You got to buy one of ours, and we'll charge you extra money for it. And that's what Jesus was throwing a fit about. And that's why he overturned those money chambers. You turned my house of prayer into a den of thieves. You guys are stealing from these people that are coming to worship God. That's what that whole thing was about. So I do think part of this was Annas ran the business of the temple, and Jesus just made a mess of things by overturning the money changers' tables. So there's a little bit of a vendetta there as well. Verse 17, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, so we're going back to the verses now, you also are not one of these men's disciples, are you? And Peter denied and said, I am not. Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. It's in the middle of the night. And they were standing and warming themselves, and Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. I'm going to give Peter a little bit of credit here. Yes, he denied Jesus and was about to deny him a third time and hear the cock crow. But you know what? Everybody else had fled. And here Peter is still there, near where all the trials are taking place. So I'll cut him a little bit of slack. Now, verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Verse 21. So why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them, and they know what I said. Verse 22. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus in the hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" This was Annas, not Caiaphas. See what I mean? It's a matter of respect. They saw him as the high priest. Rome called somebody else the high priest, but Annas was the go-to guy. Jesus answered him and said, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Well, so again, the guards say he's the high priest, but Annas is not, but he is in their eyes. It was unlawful, though, to hold a trial at night. And that's exactly what was going on. And the high priests were not even supposed to directly question the defendant. They did all of this because they were trying to figure out how to hurry this up before the high Sabbath of Passover, because then you could not execute anybody before that. Now, Jesus saying, "Call witnesses," to be the only person directing this trial, because he's saying, well, at least do this thing correctly. They're breaking all the rules to hurry this thing up. And he's just appealing to what was actually to do something decently and in order. So clearly, this is demonstrating that this whole trial is rigged. This was not fair. But, when you look at this, all indignant. Jesus knew all this was going to happen. He knew that they were going to, railroad him on here. It's not going to be fair. And you don't want life to be fair. God's not fair. Oh, why do you say that, Bill? If God was fair, you would have gotten what you deserved. You don't want that. That's why he came and died on the cross. So that wasn't fair. That actually God's favor is on your side, rescuing you from, the sin and the bondage that you're in. So you don't want God to be fair. Verse 25. Now, Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" "Oh, yeah, I cut my relative's ear off." Peter again denied it. And at once, as soon as he did that, because that was the third time, a rooster crowed. And he was broken. He realized, because he was saying, "No way." And Jesus said, "You're going to deny me 3 times." He goes, "I ain't going to deny you. Everybody else might deny it, but I'm not going to deny it." And he's the only one that did. And so he was a mess after that. Verse 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, and it was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to meet them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" So this is the ultimate of hypocrisy and religious hypocrisy, is they wanted to stay pure so they could kill a guy. How's that for hypocrisy? "Thou shalt not kill," which, in the original Hebrew means "thou shalt not murder an innocent person." They didn't want to kill someone who was innocent, but they don't want to go into the praetorium or the governor's mansion so that they can be ceremonially clean, pure before God, so they can murder somebody. This is odd. Verse 30. They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And here's what I mean by that, because we know the messianic prophecies. Jesus predicted himself that the Son of Man will be lifted up in his death, the cross. But that is by Gentile hands. So he knew he was going to be executed by Rome not by the Jews. Why do I know that? Because the Jewish form of execution is to be stoned to death. And so to be lifted up on the cross was predicted, and he knew he had to be handed over to the Gentiles, which is a fulfillment of messianic prophecy. Now, verse 33, so Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" It's interesting. Even here, Jesus is trying to go after Pilate's heart, having a conversation with him to see, where's this? Are you just echoing what other people have told you, or are you picking this up on your own? In verse 35, Pilate answered and said, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." So he's very clearly saying, my kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. And then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. And for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And before I go into this whole aspect of truth, because the dialogue here is really fascinating, it's interesting when it says, "Are you a king?" And he says, "My kingdom is a spiritual kingdom." And for strategic reasons. He wants to be rejected by his own people, fulfillment of messianic prophecy. But also, if he were to say, "Yes, I am a king," that would have been all the treason they needed to be executed by Rome. But is to be handed over by the leaders of the Jewish nation. So moving on from there, Jesus speaks of a spiritual kingdom. But we do see in Matthew 28 that it will be dealing with kingdoms politically in the future, in the end times as well. Because it says this in Revelations 11, verse 15. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." And this is, you see this also in the book of Daniel. In the days of those kings, God will set up his kingdom, and it'll never be destroyed. It will not be left for another. His kingdom will endure forever and ever. And we see this thing stated again in Revelations 11. It's in the book of Daniel and Revelations 11. And so it will be overcoming or toppling over political governments in the end days. But at this point, it's a spiritual kingdom. Pilate doesn't know what to do. He's really stuck. And his wife had a dream, which I'm not going to go into those details in the Gospel of John, because it goes in more detail in other books. Pilate is not a Roman. He was actually Spanish, but he married Caesar Augustus's granddaughter, which is why he got this job, basically. And he didn't know what to do with it. He doesn't know what to do with Jesus. He's trying to balance. What he's wanting to do is avoid a riot. Last time he saw Jesus come into Jerusalem, which was on Sunday, right, in the 10th of Nisan, right, or Nisan, or which is the beginning of the Passover. He saw these masses and multitudes saying, "Hosanna, Son of David." This guy's going to throw a riot and create a mess, and he can't allow that. So he's afraid if he goes through with this pressure, there's going to be a riot. So he thought he had this thing set in place because everybody loved Jesus and he wanted to appease this. But then, he's dismissing what Jesus said here, because if you go back here, Jesus said, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And so then Pilate says in verse 38, what is truth? Veritas is the word for truth. What is truth? But here's what's interesting. He said that more in a dismissive way. This isn't a legitimate question because he asked it, and before Jesus could answer, he walked away. So he basically said, what is truth? And then leaves. He wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for, philosophically going to dismiss you with that statement. This was not an actual question. It should have been a real dialogue. He would have found out that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But he was just trying to dismiss him in his mind, what Jesus was saying. Just like today, I run into people all the time. People want to say they have their truth instead of acknowledging absolute truth and that Jesus is the truth. After he had said this, Pilate, and he just dismissed him, walked away, he went back outside to the Jews and told him, I find no guilt on him. Because he was afraid everybody's going to riot. So he's like, this guy's fine. But you have a custom. So he's trying to balance two things out. He's trying to appease the crowds that he thinks are for Jesus. And he wants to appease the Pharisees so they don't throw a fuss. So he's just trying to calm all the waters. So he goes, you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you your leader, the King of the Jews? Hosanna, son of David? That's what they were saying when they said that. And they cried out, the crowd. And this blew his mind. He wasn't expecting this because they were offering Barabbas, who was a robber, who stole to a level where it was a capital offense. One of the selfish men in the society you could imagine. Now, his name, Barabbas, Bar means son of. Abba is father, son of a father. And so it's a pretty generic name, but he was a thief. And so he was brought up to be the two choices because he was despicable. Nobody respected Barabbas. And here's Jesus, who was the guy that everybody was doing the palm branches saying, Hosanna, son of David, come and rescue us and all this, when he came into Jerusalem just a few days earlier. So he thought, the crowd is going to rescue me from having to make this decision. He was wrong. Not this man, but Barabbas is what the crowd shouted. They turned. So that also makes it very interesting to me. Why people want to be famous and get the accolades of the crowd. The crowd's fickle. They were saying, Hosanna, son of David, just a few days ago. Now they're saying, crucify him. Same guy, same crowd. Easily swayed. Barabbas was selfish. He was not a zealot with a cause-driven motive. He was a selfish thief, and the people were choosing the most selfish person in the world over the most selfless person in the world. And now Pilate is stuck. He thought he's going to be able to avoid this because they're going to choose Jesus because they were just all happy about him a few days ago. And now we're going to find out as we go into chapter 19 about all the details of it coming out of there.